Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming you to today's mini conference on white Christian nationalism in the United States, sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture and the Association of Religion Data Archives, both housed at the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. That's a lot right there. Let's take a breath. Over the last 30 years, the center has been engaging the topics of religion, American culture, and the concerns of the day with scholars and the broader public with its biennial conferences, its Young Scholars in American Religion, and most recently, our monthly Religion and Virtual series, where we invite scholars and public intellectuals to bring cutting-edge questions and interventions to the major topics of the day. Today, we turn our attention to white Christian nationalism. The Trump presidency, culminating in the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021, brought into sharp relief the role of white Christian nationalism as an animating force in American civil society. Studies that we will talk about today have suggested that millions of Americans believe that the United States should be distinctively Christian in many of its public spaces, amongst its sacred symbols and its national identity. These beliefs are inextricably tied to notions of whiteness and white supremacy and are central to what we understand as American identity. As the insurrection, many theological statements, and local and political organizing have made clear, the implications of white Christian nationalism are real and have far-reaching consequences. So this online mini conference brings together the leading scholars, authors, journalists, public experts, and public theologians in order to discuss white Christian nationalism, its history, and its future from a variety of perspectives, making it a truly unique opportunity to explore these issues. The first panel in our conference today of two is entitled White Christian Nationalism, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and will revolve around this topic from a particularly cross-disciplinary perspective with a focus on scholars and thinkers from history and law and social science. Our second panel will be engaging white Christian nationalism in public spaces. This panel will move beyond the study of white Christian nationalism to include journalists, clergy, and public theologians to think more about how this topic impacts and influences the public sphere. If you have not registered for the second session, you will need a separate Zoom link for this in order to attend. So please complete the link that's being dropped into the chat right now to register for this second session. I'll give everyone a few seconds to do that. And again, welcoming folks who are making their way into the room. As we transition into this first session, please make note of the following Zoom instructions and protocol that we're going to have at play during our conversation this afternoon. The chat feature is going to be disabled. And so if you want to interface or ask questions of our dynamic panel this afternoon, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom. So you should be able to see that and be able to submit your questions through that. This will enable our hosts and panelists to engage these questions and facilitate this important conversation with the many of you that have joined us this afternoon. And so those are our two basic instructions. And with no additional instructions, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the first panel this afternoon, Dr. Andrew Whitehead. Andrew Whitehead is an associate professor of sociology and the director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI. Dr. Whitehead's research focuses on how religion both shaped and is shaped by contemporary American culture. He is the co-author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which has been receiving a lot of press, and he was pointing to it in his screen, if you can see behind him. And he is the author of over 50 or 60 peer-reviewed, it changes every day, journal articles. And it is my pleasure to introduce him as he will be taking the reins right now and introduce our august panel, who are all prescient and important narrators of the pressing issue of white Christian nationalism in today's culture. Thank you so much for joining us, and I now will hand it over to Dr. Andrew Whitehead.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. Appreciate that introduction. And again, welcome to everybody joining us. Really excited for the conversation that we have ahead of us today, and so glad that you're here with us. So again, excited about session 2 that's coming up. You can find that link in the chat. Be sure to register for that. And so let's just get started. And to do that, I would love to introduce our panelists so that we can dive right in. So I will start. First, we have with us Dr. Anthea Butler. She is the chair of religious studies and the newly promoted full professor of religious studies and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And her work focuses on African American religion, history, race, politics, and evangelicalism broadly. And her newest book is titled White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. And next we have Professor Caroline Malak-Corbin, and she is professor of law and the Dean's Distinguished Scholar at the University of Miami School of Law. And her work appears in a slew of the most prestigious law reviews in the country, and she is a leading legal scholar on First Amendment issues. And we also have with us Dr. Kristen Cobes-Dumais, and she is professor of history at Calvin University and a specialist in the intersections of religion, gender, and politics in recent American history. And she is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, pretty cool to say that, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And finally, we have with us Dr. Samuel Perry, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oklahoma and the leading social scientist examining conservative Christianity in American politics, race, sexuality, and families. And so he is a co-author, along with me, of Taking America Back for God. And his newest book, due out in 2022 from Oxford, is titled The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, that he co-authored with Philip Gorski. So welcome, panelists, and thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. All right, so there is a lot to get to in the next 75 minutes. And so we want to leave some time near the end again for the question and answer session. So I'll begin with some questions directed at particular panelists based on specializations. But again, feel free to chime in as you feel necessary and something a fellow panelist might say, because we're all going to benefit from hearing your insight no matter where the conversation takes us. And so again, the goal of this session is to highlight what various academic disciplines, how they're studying white Christian nationalism, what they're finding, its prevalence and importance for the current context. And again, this will set us up nicely for our next session, again, which people can still register for, of how we engage it in the public sphere. So to begin, I think it's really important that we first define as simply and straightforwardly as we can white Christian nationalism, because I know that there are others that want to define it in a particular way for particular purposes. And so based on your work and in your academic disciplines, what exactly are we talking about? So in a couple sentences, could you each provide a definition that you or your field generally uses when we're trying to understand white Christian nationalism? And Dr. Butler, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'm appreciating being here with everyone. I think the way that I would define white Christian nationalism is a belief that Christianity is for basically white people, and that for everyone else, you need to accept the cultural ideas of what that Christianity means, first of all. And then secondarily, that also means that you have a fealty to America and the definitions of America that these white Christians believe in. In other words, it's not just about how you practice your Christianity, but it's a practice of Christianity that engages with the idea that whiteness is the driving force behind Christianity, first of all, and that secondarily, America plays a special role in the way that Christianity is going to be lived out or read prophetically in the kind of ways people read scripture.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Corbin, how about you?
Well, my definition is based on your work. And so I define Christian nationalism as the belief that the United States has always been, and should always be a Christian nation. It's the belief that the United States has a special relationship with God, the God of Christianity, of course, and that in order to maintain God's favor, the United States as a society, including its government, must uphold Christian values. In other words, it's pretty much the antithesis of the Establishment Clause command to keep church and state separate. Because Christian nationalism not only rejects separation of church and state, which lies at the heart of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, but it believes in the complete overlap of Christianity and the government.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Dumais?
Yeah, so I wrote my book while you two were writing yours. And so I didn't benefit from your definition, but we came awfully close. And I'm a cultural historian, and I came up with a very simple definition, just describing what I was seeing. And essentially, it's the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and must be defended as such. And that defense takes the form of defending Christian orthodoxy, as those in power define it. It involves defending the privileged space of white Christianity within American society. And it also involves defending America in terms of foreign policy, military, and so forth. And the adjective white in all of this is extremely important, as has already been stated very clearly, and particularly by Anthea here.
Thank you. Yeah, and Sam.
Yeah, I think I concur with all of the panelists. I'll just add a little bit of nuance. I think I am also starting to think of Christian nationalism both as a political theology that people hold at the individual level, but also a political strategy that one doesn't necessarily need to hold to execute. So, for example, white Christian nationalism can be an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of ethnicized Christianity that white conservative Christians favor and feel like this is the definition of Christianity. And I think that's the kind that we're picking up in surveys. But I think what we see among, say, Donald Trump and I think his surrogates and people like him, we don't necessarily believe any of this, but they're very effective at leveraging Christian nationalism as an ideology and utilizing it to be able to mobilize and to depend on that for votes and to use it as a scare tactic and that kind of thing. And so Christian nationalism, both as an ideology and a political strategy, both work hand in hand to bring about, I think, favored goals.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you all for that. And so, having defined it now, I think the next big question that I think all of us here, and especially after the insurrection, that some Christian leaders or politicians might levy at some of our work is how prevalent really is white Christian nationalism, right? Is it just a fringe ideology, right? The people that stormed the Capitol, that's just way on the outside. There isn't anything about white Christian nationalism that is prevalent in our society. And I think it's important, in this session too, to not only define it, but think through that question. So, Dr. Perry, I'll come back to you. Since you continue to gather data on white Christian nationalism, can you share a bit about what we know right now concerning the prevalence of this political ideology and theology? So how many Americans embrace it? Where is it primarily located? Is it just fringe? And then too, we'll open up if other panelists have thoughts as well about prevalence. But yeah, Dr. Perry, let's start with you.
Sure. I think so many people have done such excellent work in tracing the narratives of Christian nationalism historically and where it emerged politically and theologically. And so I think if there's a unique contribution that we have, Andrew and I, I'm including you in this, sociologists and quantitative scholars of Christian nationalism have tried to tease out is to look making estimates of okay, how common is this among American public? And for that, we draw upon national surveys that allow us to ask Americans questions and to see not just among leaders, but the grassroots individuals. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen, and I think what I want to do is I want to set the bar high and not use something that might be indicative of Christian nationalism, like say someone's attitude toward prayer in public schools, or whether you think Christian values are a good thing. Those doesn't necessarily have to say Christian nationalism, but let's use a really narrow definition. Somebody who thinks the federal government should declare us a Christian nation, I would consider by definition a Christian nationalist. So how common is that view, and is that fringe. Let's just take a quick look. All right. So this is real briefly what I've done here is I've just made a distribution, and this is adds up to 100%. And so we can look at it from left to right, but this is the percentage of this population that believes the federal government should declare us a Christian nation, pretty explicitly Christian nationalist statement. So among all Americans, you've got a little over a quarter, between a quarter and 30% that agree with this statement at some level. This is all Americans. I haven't defined this down at all. And so, you know, you're looking over a quarter of Americans at the very least who would affirm that statement at some level. When we start looking at all white Christians, this starts to grow, and this is right at 45% now. Okay, so that's obviously not a small group. When we get to white evangelicals, we're looking at the vast majority now. We're looking roughly at about 2/3 of white evangelicals who would affirm this. Oh, sorry, not 2/3. We're looking well over 50% of white evangelicals who would affirm this statement. But what I want to point to is it's not just about being a white evangelical. So we see among white liberal Protestants who consider themselves not born again evangelical Christians, white Roman Catholics, you've got anywhere between 25% to 30%. And this is also what I want to point out. This is white nothing in particular. People who have the option on a survey to say I'm a Christian or I'm whatever, and they say I'm nothing. They're the nuns. And here we see 16%. This is about a sixth of the nuns. Now that's not a huge percentage, but think about this. 16% of the nuns say that they would favor the United States being defined formally as a Christian nation. What we can take away from this at the very least is that among evangelicals, it's the majority who would affirm a very explicit statement of Christian nationalism. Among white Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants, you're looking at over a quarter at the very least. And even among people who are unaffiliated with Christianity or informally unaffiliated with Christianity, they would say, a sixth of them would say, yes, this is a good thing. We ought to do this. Now, this is, I think, where we're getting into Christian nationalism doesn't necessarily have to be Christian. You don't have to be a Christian to affirm it. And you certainly don't have to be an evangelical. All you have to think is that this language of Christianity and the national identity, that sounds like it favors people like me. And that's, I think, what we're really getting to in Christian nationalism is a kind of a language and a mindset that says this nation is for people like me with my traditions, my views, and my culture.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Sam, for that. Yeah, other panelists, any thoughts on prevalence? Yeah, go ahead, Professor Corbin, and then Dr. Butler.
I think a disturbingly large number of people in this country are on board with the way that Christian nationalism sort of creates an in-group of Christians and an out-group of non-Christians. So, I mean, if you think about it, if a true America is a Christian America, then true Americans are Christians. And the flip side of that is that non-Christians are not true Americans. And an unsettling number of Americans share this view. So looking at public opinion polls, about 1/3 of Americans, 1 out of every 3, agree that being Christian is very important to being a true American. And about another 20% say that it's somewhat important. And I think the numbers might have gone down a bit in the most recent survey, but I still think that roughly half of Americans are walking around this country believing that Christianity is a prerequisite to true belonging and citizenship. And all these people may not be hardcore white Christian nationalists, but enough of the ethos has seeped into their understanding of who is a real American. And this is a startling, if not terrifying, proposition to those of us Americans who are not Christian.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And the other part of what I really like what you did there to show how many people who aren't early Christians, or sort of the 16.5%, because I think that's actually crucial to understanding what happened on 1/6, right? Because you had a lot of people there who are like, they're not normal churchgoers, they're not regular churchgoers, but there's something about when we say Christian in America that connotes something to people in their head that they go past whether they believe in God or not. it's somehow equated with the right to be in power, the right to be the people who direct other people in this country, and the right to make the rules the way that they want to make them. And I have an example in my book that I wasn't quite using for nationalism, but I think it really works, about an interracial couple who asked to get married at a place in Mississippi, and they were told that they couldn't because we only do people who are Christians. To sort of say, in other words, that interracial marriage was wrong, first of all, and then secondarily, that you must not be Christian if you were going to marry outside of your race, i.e., white. Right. So I think these are important kinds of things that your survey shows, and that we really need to pay attention to this, because, as I used to call it, sometimes this is a mixture of the church going Christians, the people who go every Sunday, and the people who I call NASCAR Christians, who only are Christians at, sort of like car events or football games and all this stuff when the pledge comes up or the Star Spangled Banner and there's a prayer, right? Those are those kind of Christians. Those are the people who identify that with a certain kind of nationalistic fervor.
Yeah, I'd add that I think exactly right to think in the God and country kind of bracket is helpful. Also, to address one of your initial questions, how is this fringe? And that's where I think the survey data is certainly helpful. No, it's not. But also the categories there that most intrigue me are the, somewhat and the neutral. Or in terms of your book, the accommodators, right? Like, to me, that's where a lot of my interest focuses, because when you include those, that's a very large swath. So you can have the ambassadors, or those who strongly agree, really, pushing the policies and shaping the conversation. But then you have a very large swath of Americans and white Christians and white evangelicals in particular, who are going to go along with us, who are going to identify with, or certainly not put on the brakes at all. And so that's the part that terrifies me, Caroline. And in terms of January 6th, those are the dynamics that I was watching very closely. I will also add that, if you talk to your ordinary white evangelical and you suggest that they might be a white Christian nationalist, they would say, absolutely not. This is not terminology that they would use to describe themselves at all. And so you're probably going to get a lot of pushback there. But as Cynthia was suggesting, this is just what it means to be Christian, right? It's just so much the air that they breathe, this kind of mashup of Christian patriotism, and it's part of their home decor. It's the flags in the front of church, and this is just Christianity to them, and that is this privileged location of white Christianity, white Christian nationalism.
Right, and just a quick follow up on that. I think we often get in our reactions to, I think, showing people the numbers on this, because it's disturbing, and a lot of conservative Christians, white conservative Christians, feel like, what are you accusing me of? Are you're attacking me? Are you saying? And they really want us to put people in camps immediately, like, hey, I'm a Christian nationalist, or I'm I like to define the person, rather than to talk about something that you're kind of falling into, like an ideology, like you can embrace more or less that on a spectrum. And even though I think there are times to use the language, you are a white Christian nationalist, I think I'm far more in favor of talking about the ideology and the belief system and that cultural framework that I can explain to people, hey, this sounds a lot like Christian nationalism that you're embracing uncritically, and rather than, I think, put them on the defensive immediately and say, I would consider you a white Christian nationalist. That's who you are now. I've clinically diagnosed you as such. I think it's far better to talk about, like, kind of the ideas and the beliefs that people are embracing, right? Like you were talking about.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you all for that insight. And so, now having defined it, talking about prevalence, we know that where we are today, we are products of our history. And so I want us to look back next at the historical trajectory of white Christian nationalism. So the reality of much of the values and the narratives and symbols that, kind of gotten put together and packaged up. And really, in some ways, tell us kind of where we are today and how we see that spreading across and within the population. So Dr. Butler and Dr. Dumais, can you share with us, from your own work and understanding and from a historical perspective, how did we arrive here today? What is some of that more recent or even further back historical trajectory that leads us to where we see much of Americans today?
I want to go to Dr. Dumais first, and then I'm going to follow up. I'll pick on you today.
I was going to pitch it to you, but okay. So I'm a 20th century Americanist. So, keep that in mind. But history is about both continuity and change. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because if you want to look for continuity, if you want to find the roots, you're going to find it. And you can go to the city upon the hill, right, to the Puritans. You can find it in terms of, defenses of slavery, certainly. Also abolitionism, if you're looking at a more kind of prophetic Christian nationalism. We can discuss whether white Christian nationalism applies there or not. You can certainly find it in late 19th, early 20th century discussions of American empire. You can find it in the First World War, right? You can find iterations of it, expressions of it, but you can also find discontinuity. I should also say, in terms of the American South, right? This kind of slaveholder Christianity as well. And so you definitely find antecedents, and you can see some of these strands coming together in different ways. But in my own research, I also wanted to show the change over time, because otherwise this can just all start to feel very inevitable. And so one of the things that I took pains to point out is, if you look in the early 20th century, here you have both liberals and conservatives, conservative Protestants, who were embracing nationalism to varying degrees. In the First World War, you had a number of conservative Protestants, evangelicals, if you will, reject Christian nationalism and embrace pacifism. In one of the reasons that surfaced a lot is America cannot be a Christian nation, because to be a Christian means that your soul is saved, and a nation does not have a soul. And besides, look around you, things aren't looking all that Christian. And so just to keep that a change over time in mind is really helpful. Where I see things really come together in the shape and form that is very recognizable to us today is really in mid-century. 1940s, coming together in the Second World War, but really solidifying in the Cold War era. And this is where you can see the idea of Christian America really gelling in terms of anti-communism, because communists were anti-God and they were anti-family, right? And they were anti-American, and it was a military threat. And so you need a military defense. And that really unified a lot of Americans in the late 40s and the early 1950s, those core values. But then the 1960s happened, and we have the civil rights movement, we have the feminist movement, and we have the Vietnam War anti-war movement. And this is when those core values really become oppositional values. And it's conservative white Christians in particular who double down when many other Americans start to question American goodness and American greatness, and question white privilege, white supremacy, and all of that comes together. And so our current iteration, it really has to be rooted in that historical moment, the 1960s, this backlash, and this moving to his core identity. And so for Americans who are embracing white Christian nationalism today, they do so with a feeling of threat. They are under siege. There is a loss that has happened. Things were great up until the 1960s, and then things fell apart. And so we have to make America great again. And here too, right, the whiteness is absolutely critical here, because that narrative makes absolutely no sense to somebody who is not white.
Yeah, I went deliberately last for a different reason, and you'll see why in a second. I think about this almost in a way about how to describe what other people think Christian nationalism is, right? And so I just taught a class this summer for a week on Black nationalism. And I think what's very interesting is to look at people who want to be outside of this American context and what they think this white Christian nationalism is. So I'm thinking about, whether that's the Nation of Islam, back to Africa movements in the 19th century with people like Henry Neal Turner and others. These are the people who are fighting against whatever it is this thing puts its head up to be, right? And so I think that's a really crucial part. And if you want to include something in that, it's not Black nationalism, but I think we have to think about the religion of the lost cause. and post-slavery to really consider what that construction is. Because if we have a Southern kind of construction that talks about God and country in very different ways than what the North thinks about it, then that actually is defining lots of the ways in which Christian nationalism shows up in the 20th century, especially in the South where, Billy Graham is, or where we have, citizens groups and all these kinds of groups that want to instantiate a certain kind of Christianity. But there's one more thing to say, and I think this is really important for what we're talking about. In terms of how we think about this in a scholarly kind of way, I think the way people have thought about Christian nationalism before has been through groups like Stormfront and other people who have been written about, in the late 80s and early 90s as this beginning of, we got to watch these nationalistic groups that are out in Idaho and all these other places. But then what happens at 9/11 is that you get a certain kind of Christian nationalism that is against everything else that is outside of this country that is trying to destroy the nation, right? So if we think about what's happening, in terms of kind of the conversation around Afghanistan right now, you can see some of this Christian nationalism rising in the conversations around what has happened in Afghanistan. But I do think that, Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again kind of thing, this declension narrative about America isn't what it used to be. We've got to get back to what it was, what Kristen was talking about in the 70s forward, is a really important point about why Christian nationalism encompasses so many more people now than it did before. Because before it was just like, oh, we're just patriots. We believe in God and country. And now it's like, we believe in God and country, and we don't want those other people to come here, and we need to go figure out how we're going to take over the rest of the world and make sure that they don't take us first.
Thank you both. Anything, from Professor Corbin and Dr. Perry with that question of the historical trajectory?
I'm not a historian, but one historical tidbit that I find really dovetail with some of the things we've heard is that at one point in the United States, you could only become naturalized as a citizen if you were white. And one of the ways they determined whether you were white or not was whether you were Christian. And so there was a real equivalence with whiteness and Christianity. And it was only when African Americans started converting to Christianity that there was a turn to creating a hierarchy based on race rather than religion. But I remember reading that and being really struck by the long history of whiteness and Christianity.
And just briefly to Dr. Butler's point, I think the idea that the declension narrative of the MAGA, the nation is going downhill fast and we've got to do something to pull it out of this nosedive. I think that probably helps explain a little bit of why there's such a close connection between, and we find this in surveys actually, in dispensational premillennialism, and Christian nationalism, that this narrative that, well, everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. This is part of God's kingdom, coming to earth, it's all going to go downhill, and this is really what we see. And so they're looking for it everywhere, everything is going down. And this story of redemption and trying to stave off Robert Jeffers, Trump's kind of main hype man during his administration in the evangelical community was often saying that this is part of what's got to happen is we can try to take the country back and stave off judgment as long as possible, but what we're witnessing is all in the Bible and what's supposed to go down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you. And so, Professor Corbin, I want to come back to you, and that historical tidbit you shared, I think is incredible to hear, and then really points to kind of a larger conversation as well with how these values and narratives of white Christian nationalism became enshrined in law. And so, with your work and an expertise on various aspects of our legal system, First Amendment, constitutional law, what are some of those? Can you give us some content or some context, right, that really helps show how this became a part of the air we breathe, but legally too, and how the U.S. functions? Well,
there are a lot of different ways to answer that, but I think one of the best examples of the way that the law has reflected and promoted Christian nationalism is the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the Establishment Clause to allow government-sponsored Christianity, whether monuments or prayers, things that really ought to be unconstitutional. And they really should violate the Establishment Clause. And again, that's the religion clause of the First Amendment, long associated with separation of church and state. And one of the core mandates of the Establishment Clause is that the government should not favor one religion over others. Avoiding favoritism among religions not only protects religious minorities from discrimination and second-class citizen, it actually protects the integrity of the favored religion as well. Yet, despite this, again and again, the Supreme Court has permitted the government to prefer Christianity, unite with Christianity, creating a hierarchy based on religion, and exactly the hierarchy sought by white Christian nationalism. And again, this is particularly obvious in the Supreme Court's decisions rejecting Establishment Clause challenges to government Christian monuments and prayers. And even in the decisions, you can see strands of Christian nationalism, or maybe I should say the Supreme Court's reasoning sometimes further embeds Christian nationalist views. So let me be a little more specific. So for example, there are hundreds of Christian Ten Commandment monuments on government property around the United States, and they're Christian, not Jewish. Jewish commandments are different. And while the Supreme Court has not allowed every display, it's allowed a lot of them. And it does so on the grounds that the Ten Commandments have played an important role in our nation's heritage, right? And that kind of reasoning perpetuates the Christian nationalist view that Christianity is inextricably linked in our nation and in our law, despite the fact that the Constitution says nothing about Christianity. Or another example are the nativity scenes that you see in villages and towns and cities across the country during Christmas season, which in the United States lasts for weeks, if not months at a time. And again, these are government nativity scenes, not private ones. And again, when a challenge on Establishment Clause grounds, sometimes the Supreme Court will strike it down. But if you surround the nativity scene with a few snowmen and candy canes and Santa Claus, it's fine for the government to put up a depiction of the birth and adoration of Jesus Christ. And again, the reasoning given is, well, it's just celebrating the holiday season or showing the historical origins of Christmas, right? So you have the Supreme Court describing a religious event as a historical fact. Or one more Christian display, the most recent one, a giant 40-foot cross on public property, towering over the middle of a busy public highway. Again, the Supreme Court allowed this government cross, arguing that it should be understood as a World War I memorial meant to commemorate the patriotic sacrifices of those who died in the First World War. And even assuming that a giant Latin cross could have a secular meaning, the equating of a Christian symbol with patriotic values is exactly what Christian nationalism aspires to, right? This equating of American with Christian. So we see this not only with Christian monuments, but with Christian prayers, which the Supreme Court has often also upheld against Establishment Clause challenges. And it's hard to come up with a better example of Christian nationalism in practice than government-sponsored Christian prayers. So there was a case, Town of Greece versus Galloway, where the Supreme Court said it's fine that most of your prayers before the town meetings are Christian, even if people have protested against them, because legislative prayers date to the founding. So I think the way the Supreme Court has allowed all this tight link between the government and Christian monuments and Christian prayers, clearly it reflects the existing Christian nationalism, but it also perpetuates it as well. And again, the Supreme Court, it hasn't done nothing to stop it, but it hasn't done nearly enough. And I think its decisions allowing it really sort of cement that link so crucial to white Christian nationalism between our nation and Christianity. And that's just the Establishment Clause jurisprudence.
Yeah, thank you so much. Other thoughts or comments from our panelists on Professor Corbin's thoughts there? And it's okay if not, we'll continue on with a connection to that, but I just don't want to limit. Well, I mean, to connect with what Professor Corbin had to say, Sam, you've gathered some data on Americans' understandings of the founding documents, the First Amendment, those types of things. And so we can see how the Supreme Court shapes legally what is going to happen and be allowed. But then too, we know that what Americans think about it or believe about it, whether it's true or not, can play a really big role as well. And so I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about white Christian nationalism and how they interpret some of those laws or the Constitution or First Amendment.
Right. So I think something we've been shocked as we fielded these various surveys and been able to ask questions and really ask questions about whether Americans understand what's in the Constitution at all, and how it connects with Christian nationalism, because I frankly feel like Christian nationalism both builds on historical misunderstandings of what happened historically and what's in the founding documents, but also perpetuates those things. And I'll just give you a quick example because I appreciate so much what Dr. Corbin shared. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so really quickly, this is across the bottom. This is that same Christian nationalism statement, and we do see this is the two questions on the side. They believe the founding documents were divinely inspired, and they believe the Constitution references our obligations to God, references our country's obligations to God several times, and it does not. But it doesn't mention God or anything like that. But as we see, is the more you affirm this Christian nationalist statement, you are far more likely not only to think the founding documents were divinely inspired, but also to hold a false understanding of what's actually in the Constitution in the First Amendment. So how prevalent is this, though, and how pervasive do we see this misunderstanding? This is the founding documents belief. This is the divine inspiration of the Declaration and the Constitution. And I just want to point out, it's among all white Christians, we do see a slight majority among all white Christians holding this view that the founding documents are divinely inspired. Among white evangelicals, it's basically half who strongly agree that the founding documents were divinely inspired. Nearly 3/4 agree with it, but basically half strongly agree with that statement. Well, what about this false understanding of the Constitution referencing our country's obligations to God? This was a true-false statement that we asked in one of our surveys, and we see little over half of all white Christians believe this to be true, that the Constitution references our country's obligations to God, and we're approaching 2/3 of white evangelicals who believe this. And I think this is powerfully connected to Christian nationalism, their tendency to embrace this ideology that really depends on God being very much so connected with our founding documents, and also a persecution complex, feeling like, you know what, the Supreme Court has taken this from us, and these liberal activist judges have robbed us of this, and this is what the nation is all about. And so I think it's been fascinating to see how both of these things kind of build on Christian nationalism, building on a historical misunderstanding and really a historical fundamentalism. And also how it not only builds on it, but it supports it and it reproduces that. And that's what we see with David Barton or Focus on the Family or those kinds of things as well.
Yeah, other reactions to some of that? What I think this kind of segues into the next kind of question that I have for you all. And this understanding of who we are as a nation through our law and what our founding documents say has implications for today. And by today, even just this year, turning to the January 6th Capitol insurrection. So you've all written and spoken about that day. And I would love to hear from each of you, thinking in terms of, what we've already discussed already, but even the last things discussed by Professor Corbin and Dr. Perry. What did we witness, and how is white Christian nationalism connected to what we saw there? And so if it's okay, Dr. Butler, would you mind starting us off and kind of connecting to these current events?
I sort of made a joke, but it wasn't a joke on Twitter that day that I said, this is white boys wilding out. And, it wasn't funny. Let me just put it that way. But I think, what we did see was this idea about Christian nationalism coming to fore, in other words, at the Capitol, taking, deciding that they could take over instead of the elected officials, instead of democracy, instead of everything else. And I think one of the things that's important is to think about the Christian symbolism that was there that day, the cross next to the guillotine, the signs about Jesus, the Christian flags alongside the Trump flags, the kinds of things that people said. But all of that, and I think this is really important for people to understand, is that for a lot of people, they thought 1-6 was an aberration, but there was lots that went into 1-6. We had Jericho marches, we had, political figures and religious figures talking about how they were going to take back America long before 1-6 happened. And there were a group of us paying attention to that. But I think that the general public, nor did the journalists pay attention to this, because they didn't understand how to understand that language, right? And they didn't know what it was that they were seeing. So when we got to 1-6 and you had, the tremendous battles that happened with the Capitol Police and the kinds of things that were said and done in the Capitol, and that, infamous prayer, right, that happened in the chambers, I think what people need to understand is that, and this is going to be hard for people to hear, but I think people need to hear it, that these kinds of movements, this kind of idealism, this kind of fervor is just the same kind of fervor that you see in other countries when countries begin to fall, and when democracies fail, and when people lose themselves in the idealism of a certain kind of rightness. And that rightness has been, reinforced by political figures and disinformation and all of this that come together to make this noxious stew that is supposed to be in the name of Jesus, but is actually in the name of insurrection.
Yeah, if I could add to that, on January 6th, right? This is where that question of, what is fringe and what is mainstream really does come into focus. And I was really taken by, first I agree that there was almost this like cosplay feeling to the whole event, even as it was being filmed, as you could just see on some of these men's faces that they weren't really sure. This is like a bunch of fun, right? This is a joke. And they're storming the Capitol and attempting a coup. I mean, talk about privilege there, that you can kind of do both at the same time. And then, yes, there was the symbolism, the cross, the Christian flag, the patches of the armor of God, which I looked up online, and they're popular items for vacation Bible schools. Right, anybody who's gone to vacation Bible school, I'm in the Lord's Army, and you can march around and things like that. So again, fringe, and where you send your kids for free summer daycare. Actually, the prayer on the floor of the Senate was one thing. I was most taken by the prayer offered by the Proud Boys on their way to the Capitol earlier that day, because you could just make it out on the video, and I think it's on the New Yorker video, and it struck me as that prayer could have been offered in any evangelical church on any given Sunday. It was just so familiar, the cadences, the words, all of it. And so, Dr. Butler's right. This is what has brought us to this place, and what has brought so many American Christians to a place that they are unable to unequivocally condemn the actions of the few on January 6th is really where we should be focused a lot of our attention on. One of the things that I like to do in my spare time is visit my local Hobby Lobby. It's just a mile down the road. And I just pulled up some of my pictures. I've written about this at the Daily Beast, but you can, I mentioned home decor earlier today. And I mean, just some examples. You can get a wall plaque of 2 6-shooters that says, "We don't call 911," with bullets for the 911. You can get wall plaques that say, "If you don't stand behind our troops, feel free to stand in front of them." And of course, the ubiquitous I kneel for the Lord, but stand for the flag plaques. You can get like this whole shelves of pro-military, pro-law enforcement. All the figurines are white, I noticed in the law enforcement area, right? So these are again, these often unspoken values, not just of Christian nationalism, but again, this militant defense of Christian America. Christian men's groups have been participating in boot camps for generations now, have been consuming this very kind of militant ideal of Christian manhood. And now the big question is, is this all in good fun? Is this something to kind of laugh at or roll your eyes at? Or in what ways does this both reflect and shape some core values that then we can see acted out in their extreme forms on January 6th? Again, how many of we saw that again the survey data, how many of those white evangelicals who embrace those views are going to find it within them to say, this is where I draw the line?
So I too was taken with all the flags and signs that day, and it really was impossible not to note that the symbols present there were both Christian and white supremacist, really supporting the idea that white Christian nationalism was part and parcel of the insurrection. And second, to sort of think about it a bit through the lens of critical race theory, because this conference isn't controversial enough, I think there really is a story to tell about white Christian privilege and white Christian outrage. I'm not exactly sure what that story is, but I think just point out that white Christians have long been privileged in the United States, both based on their religious and racial identity, even if they've not recognized this fact. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of privilege, whether white privilege or Christian privilege or the combination, is the privileged group's obliviousness to the fact that they have it easier than others. And whenever there's a move away from privileging some towards equality, that's a step down for the privileged. And that step down is often experienced as hostility and even attack. Again, because the privileged don't realize that they're simply moving towards equality. And so I think there's this really potent combination of entitlement and perceived victimhood and fear and anger. And so, right, this is sort of the typical reaction of white Christian fragility. So I don't know how much of that lays behind the insurrection or simply white Christian nationalism in general, but I definitely think it's an important part of the story.
Can I just respond to that very quickly before Samuel? Yeah, it's really important, but let's put this together and make it lock like a Lego, okay? What you just said is really true, but it's also true that there's a narrative for evangelicals that they've always been persecuted. So that persecution narrative lined up with this other thing creates a powerful mix, a very powerful mix. So when you have people who feel like they're persecuted, they feel like they're losing their privilege. And as a matter of fact, as many of them have said, they feel like they are the ones now who are the undeserved, the unrecognized group, the group that needs to be taken care of. You have a situation that creates the kind of mess that we saw on 1/6. And that's what it is. It really is, the loss of privilege, the idea that I'm losing something that I'm not going to be able to get back to some other people who don't deserve it. And I'm always persecuted anyway because I'm a Christian. So all of that just makes for a very powerful mix.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, I just amen to all of that. I think just real briefly, I think we surveyed Americans on early February, just after Biden's inauguration, and so the insurrection was still fresh in everybody's minds. And I just want to show you quickly, and because I think this dovetails with a lot of what you're talking about. Like I want you to see how quickly how quickly Christian nationalism flips from this is something that was Trump's fault, Trump's instigation, to people of color's fault, and this is so I'll just give you a couple of examples. And here I don't use the same question. I'll just use our scale. What we do in Taking America Back is we organize into 4 categories: rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. ambassadors being true believers of Christian nationalism. So real quick, so this is 4 questions. President Trump holds much of the blame for the event escalating to violence. The violence was the result of misinformation spread by Trump and others. So rejectors high on this, ambassadors almost nobody, basically like 10% of ambassadors would admit something else. But look at the opposite trend over here. Outside agitators like Antifa and Black Lives Matter were mixed into the crowd that started the violence. Obviously false, proven false and demonstrably untrue, and yet we see over 80%, basically 85% of white ambassadors believing this to be true. And the events of 1/6 are overblown compared to the racial riots and looting America witnessed in the summer of 2020. So real quick to pivot and to say, hey, that was nothing, January 6th, it wasn't Trump's fault anyways. Really, it was Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And by the way, last summer was so much worse than anything we witnessed at the Capitol. And I think those things have to be connected carefully from we're to blame, we did anything wrong, to no, by the way, it's actually the dangerous out of control wilding minorities who are at the core of this.
As I said that day, had there been any Black person, a group of Black people out there on that lawn, they would have never gotten up to the steps of the Capitol. We all know this. So I love seeing that, but I hate seeing it at the same time, because it just proves how disinformation has really influenced people and how that is used as a weapon to continue to make these kinds of divisions.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, I know we're getting close here, and I knew we would run out of time, and I want to get to questions from those attending. But before we do that, I would like, again, to direct this question to all of you, and, in kind of a succinct way, if you can, looking ahead, to those in your various fields of study or across academia, what should they be paying attention to with white Christian nationalism, whether it's our historical understandings that need further exploration, or Sam, other arenas of public life that we find white Christian nationalism as a major influence, or Professor Corbin, legal scholars, where else we need to or direct attention. I would love to hear, and I think those attending too, with kind of within this academic realm, what work is still needed to be done. And so if it's okay, Sam, do you want me to start with you?
Yeah, I'll just get mine out of the way, and I want to hear from my fellow panelists here. So real quick, I shared this on Twitter today because I think it really is what we're dealing with. So the Afghanistan crisis, we're going to deal with the refugee crisis, and how do we solve this problem of all of these people running for their lives, and we need to help them. Christian nationalism is going to be powerfully associated with us outright refusing to help any of these people. And I'll just give you an example of where we see this. We see this in recent data that we collected as recently as February. So let me just go to this. This is across. Federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. And this is, U.S. should decrease the number of refugees. America should cease accepting Muslim refugees, should pass a law to prevent Muslim refugees. They're a terrorist threat. They pose a threat to traditional values. They drain the economy. As Christian nationalism increases, all of these attitudes increase. Anti-refugee, except for one group. Look at the red one right here. That's Christian refugees. So attitudes don't change. As Christian nationalism increases, your willingness to accept Christian refugees does not change, but Muslim refugees or anywhere else that actually is you're powerfully opposed to those kinds of things. And so I think this is actually something that we're going to have a national conversation about, need to pay attention to.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think one of the things that's really important right now for people who are in either religious studies environments or divinity or seminary schools is to realize you need to start talking about Christian nationalism and teaching about what it is. Because I think that a lot of your students have these ideas and they don't even know that they have them, right? First of all, and so you have to sort of introduce them to the fact that this is not quite the way that this works, right? Or this is not quite the way that Christianity in its purest kind of form, if there is a pure form, we can think about it, that these are American ideals and these are ideas that you see on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or all these other places. First of all, I think there's a way in which we really have to start talking about this and thinking about how we talk about nationalism more broadly. And in my field of African-American religious history, we have to, because we talk about this all the time in terms of, the history of Black America. But I think for, a broader history of America writ large, we really do have to start talking about this and writing about it more. And I will say this because I'm a pessimist. We have not seen the last of 1/6. And that is just the truth. It's going to come back in another kind of way. I'm looking ahead to the 22 election and especially the 24 election, what is happening right now with COVID and all of these kinds of things and the ways in which people are fighting about masks, because that in itself is a nationalistic kind of conversation too, whether we like it or not. And I think that more of us need to, step it up, let's put it that way, and put our voices out here, not just in the scholarly realm, but in the public sphere, to talk about how detrimental these things really are.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Session two, right? Dr.
Yes.
Butler is, perfect segue. But yeah, sorry, Dr. Dumais.
Yeah, I'd agree that we need to talk about it, and your work, Andrew and Sam, has really helped, I think, give a vocabulary and facilitate that conversation over the past year. It's been really important in that respect. I think that we need to see things like the anti-CRT movement as simply the latest expression of white Christian nationalism. Obviously, this did not come out of nowhere, so we need to situate it appropriately. I also think that, we could continue to pay attention to the sites of cultural production. Where are these values really housed? How do people learn these beliefs? How do they come to embrace Christian nationalism? Catherine Wellman has a new book coming out soon, Hijacking History, that is an incredible presentation, highly detailed presentation of essentially white Christian nationalism in homeschool textbooks and these materials that are used in Christian schools. And again, popular culture, from home decor to Christian radio, right? Very important. Televangelism, all these, we have to, these tend to be off the radar for people who are not in these communities, but it's really hard to overstate the significance of this kind of cultural and religious and political formation. Finally, I think that it would be very, very helpful to have some more ethnographic studies to understand how take your categories from ambassadors to rejectors and everything in between. Often those can actually be found within the same church, within the same community, or within the same family. And so I'm always intrigued by, what explains within these common spaces, how some could become diehard ambassadors and others resistors, and what can change somebody, what can shift somebody from one category towards another on the spectrum. And so I think we could use some very, very careful ethnographic work here too.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
And,
yeah, Professor Corbin.
Yeah, and so my eye is on the Supreme Court. And sadly, I don't anticipate much improvement. So first, I don't see this Supreme Court curbing government-sponsored Christianity anytime soon. And second, I fear that this Supreme Court will continue to decide religious liberty cases in ways that contribute to the flourishing of white Christian nationalism, because I think the Supreme Court will bend over backwards to accommodate Christian employers and Christian businesses who are seeking religious liberty exemptions from laws designed to promote equality. So, this is not your grandmother's religious liberty exemptions where you had a religious minority like a Jewish man who wants an exemption from dress codes so that he can wear his yarmulke. Instead, you're looking at cases or exemptions like the one the Supreme Court granted to Hobby Lobby stores, speaking of Hobby Lobby, right? Where you had a billion-dollar company get an exemption from healthcare requirements to provide certain contraception to women. And so now we have women who can't get basic healthcare. And so again, there are many Christian business owners, many Christian social service organizations also who want a religious right to discriminate against LGBTQ clients and customers. And I think this ties to white Christian nationalism for a couple of reasons. First, these exemptions are usually sought by white Christians, right? So the religious objectors who are winning the right to refuse healthcare or the right to discriminate are almost all white Christians. And I don't think enough has been made of this fact. And second, these kinds of exemptions, religious liberty exemptions that the Supreme Court seems to be on board granting, allows the more powerful Christian employers, Christian organizations to sort of impose their beliefs on others. So I think under both the Establishment Clause and religious liberty, the Supreme Court has really enabled through law the promotion of white Christian values.
Thank you all for that. All right, and so we have a bit of time left. So I'm going to turn to some questions, and I've been trying to scroll through the Q&A to pick some out and kind of see what people are asking. And so we'll do these as kind of a quick hit. And
a lot of good ones.
Yeah, there are, and hopefully get at least one of you, and then we'll move on to the next one to try and get as many as we can. But okay, so here's my first question that comes from a number of the people that are with us today. Are you all saying that white Americans shouldn't be patriotic, right? So what's the difference with white Christian nationalism and patriotism? So can one of you dive in and help us kind of distinguish that so that, yeah, are we not supposed to be patriotic or love our country?
No, I'll just quick take this. No, be patriotic, but it depends on how we define the country. It defines how we define who we are, right? That's key here. Who are real Americans? Who are true Americans? And you can have a patriotism that is inclusive, and a patriotism that, particularly within the nation. And then we can talk about what a healthy patriotism looks like in terms of international relations as well. But patriotism, love of country, is not a bad thing. And that's, I think, why often too, we're distinguishing white Christian nationalism. We're not talking about patriotism. And one could argue that patriotism must entail a love of country, a desire to improve, and even a prophetic vision of kind of achieving our aspirational ideals.
Yeah, so I would say patriotism is, yay, America is great. Christian nationalism is, America is Christian and Christian Americans are great.
Okay, yeah, thank you both for that. Okay, next one. The census shows that the white population is declining as a proportion of our country. What implications might this have for white Christian nationalism in the United States?
I'm going to say something here, and I know Samuel will have something really good to say here. But I think that this has been latched onto as a way to put fear into people, right? We've been seeing this demographic change for a long time. And I think that the ways in which this is rolled out in the media is almost, it is in a way to make white people afraid, like I'm losing my country. And so the very people that we might be talking about today, white Christian nationalists, will get galvanized by that particular, census poll, because, half the people didn't fill out the census anyway because they hate the government. So, do we really know? This is sort of my question here is like, do we even really know the numbers? And if it is the case, and that may be the case, then what does that mean in terms of civic engagement? I think that, the previous question about patriotism, that saying whether we can't be patriotism versus nationalism, patriotism and nationalism are two different things. But one of the things that's really important is, who do you think is a citizen? Who do you think gets to be involved? Who do you think has the right to be able to say, God bless America, right? You know, so I think we have to ask ourselves these kinds of questions when we see this kind of polling happen, and to try not to put fear into people about what they think they're losing.
Dr. Butler nailed it. I got nothing to add to that. Great.
All right, thank you. Now, the historians on our panel understand the value of nostalgia, how powerful that can be and is. And it's usually owned by those on the right, generally, politically. And so what can be done by scholars, academics, or those engaging this in the public sphere to kind of re-mythologize or present a different narrative for Americans to latch onto that maybe moves us away from white Christian nationalism towards kind of, as the person asking this question talked about, kind of the happy, better portions of what it means to be an American. What might be done? What can be done? What do you all think?
I'm a historian. It's not going to be happy. Okay, let's just get that out there right now, that it's, you know, happy and historian do not come in the same sentence, right? Because we're going to tell you the truth. And I think that one of the things, I mean, I want to bring up what Kristen said about, you know, CRT being another tool in this toolbox about white Christian nationalism. I mean, the work that I do every day just to teach African American religious history would be called, you know, CRT. And I'm like, is it CRT for me to show, you know, the kinds of things that Billy Graham said, or is it CRT for me to show, you know, the Citizens Council from Mississippi? You know, is it CRT for me to show, you know, a segregation school and to talk about Bob Jones? So you know, there's ways we could play with this. But I think that what people need to understand is that we need a fullness of history, not just the happy histories that we want to tell ourselves about America, because this focus on nostalgia is why we're in this problem in the first place. You know, back in the 50s, people did take their polio vaccine. Now we can't get anybody to take a COVID vaccine that's for free, that'll save their lives. So, you know, I'd like to have some nostalgia about having common sense. That would be great.
Too, we can think in terms of aspiration, ideals. I mean, look at the 1619 Project, and I think it's often this misperception on the right that, I mean, just because we're looking at negative things in history, that we are dour and depressed individuals. It's not. It inspires hope and change, right? Change, that we can be better. We have some ideals. Yes, we failed. Yes, we've failed repeatedly. We've also had so many examples of people who have pushed for greater liberty and justice for all, and that can be our tradition. That can be our narrative. And don't you want to participate in that?
Yeah, so that was what I was gonna say. I think we have certain ideals in our Constitution that we have never yet achieved, but it's something that we have them. And to the extent we want to build a mythology, we can try and build a mythology on promising equality, hoping for equality for all, and really emphasizing the fact that we have come from all over, and that we have people, you know, we have so many different, so sort of the sort of, we welcome all. I mean, we don't, but if you're talking about a more beneficial mythology, that's probably the mythology I would go for.
Yeah, I would actually just, the only thing I would add is 3 books that are talking about these things, recent books. So Jill Lepore's This America, The Case for the Nation. I think she talks about this creedal patriotism that I think can unite Americans. She thinks historians ought to be writing about as well. Stephen Smith at Yale, political philosopher, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes, fantastic book. And also Samuel Goldman, After Nationalism, also argues for like a creedal patriotism. And so I would say if somebody's looking for a start of like, what's a way forward, we kind of unite around this aspirational patriotism, I think these are 3 recommendations I give.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you all. There are a couple more really great questions that I wanted to get to, but hopefully in our next session, then we'll get to those of, you know, how can people be Christian without being Christian nationalists, or how can they resist the persecution narrative? But I think what we'll need to do now to allow everybody to move to the next one is start to wrap this up. And so first, I want to say thank you to each of you for taking the time today to share your expertise. Really grateful for that. And I encourage the attendees to find each of our panelists through social media and buying their books and supporting their work. It's really important. They're doing really incredible, important work, and so grateful for them. And to those of you that joined us, thank you so much for your interest, for all the questions. I mean, there were, what's the number now? 135. Sorry, we weren't able to get to all of those. But thank you for taking time. And so be sure to register for session 2, because they're going to build on this work and I think answer a lot of the questions that we saw of how we do engage this and move forward. And so you'll see that link in the chat. And you can also find the link to a survey. If you're going to join us for session 2, please wait until after that session to complete the survey. But if you're unable to, we would really appreciate it if you would click that link. It takes 2 minutes. There's like 7 or 8 questions, I think, would really help us as we plan for the future here at the center and using this time. We're doing similar things like this. And so again, we hope to see you in session 2. Thank you to our panelists again, for those of you that joined us, and the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI, and especially Phil Goff, Joseph Tucker Edmonds, Lauren Chisholm, and Nate Wynn for all their support for this mini conference, and especially to those of you that joined us. And so this will be recorded, is recorded, will be posted, and we'll be sharing that within the next week. And so again, thank you to all, and hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, and look forward to seeing you in about 15 minutes in session 2 about engaging white Christian nationalism in public spaces. So thanks again. See you, everyone.
Thank you.